sure that you all know where it is. So we're located in this densely populated area in the west of Germany. And the reason why I'm mentioning that is we have this very young research center that brings together the three biggest universities in the region. And we're very open to collaboration and hosting visitors. So if you ever want to come by for a short visit, long visit, and are interested in doing research that at least loosely aligns with trustworthy AI, we're very happy to collaborate. Stephen mentioned, I'm interested in how AI influences our ethical behavior. And that stems from my previous research that I did during my PhD and postdoc, which was on the social psychology of corruption. And so in that research, I actually combined social psychology and behavioral economics methods to understand the social forces that shape our ethical behavior. And at the time of doing the postdoc at the University of Amsterdam, I came across a paper by Iyad Rawan, who's at the Max Planck Institute in Berlin, that argued that we should actually increasingly take, algorithms as serious in their roles as we do humans. And so I was lucky enough to join Iyad and the newly founded Center for Humans and Machines, and we started thinking about all the different ways in which AI might actually influence our ethical behavior. We wrote a conceptual paper, a sort of a review paper on this, where we tried to look at the situation that we kind of tried to depict with this little icon here, where you're facing an ethical dilemma between abiding by an ethical rule, for example, the rule of honesty, or breaking it for profit. We wanted to know what we know about how AI actually influences us when we face such decisions. And at that time, we basically just reviewed the literature that was available. I mean, if you see it, it was published in 2022. So for AI terms, it's very ancient. So some of the stuff that I'm going to present is maybe outdated by now. But I think just the general framework still applies. So the framework that we can put forward, basically one that differentiates the influence of AI in different roles. And the four roles that we identified were the roles of a role model, where you basically observe the behavior of an algorithmic system. And the question is whether people would blindly imitate it. And when it came to the available evidence at the time, we didn't really see a lot of evidence that people would just blindly copy unethical behavior of algorithmic systems. So we color coded it in green. And as you can see with this little traffic light system, that means the influence of AI on us in this particular role is less strong than that of a human. The second role we identified is the role of a partner. So you teaming up with an AI system to break an ethical rule. And there we found mixed evidence. So that basically there are some reasons to believe that partners would have a stronger pull on our moral compass as a partner, but also somewhere that actually shown that it's less influential. So we color coded it in yellow based on the available evidence. But the two roles that I want to focus on today the most is the role of a delegate and the role of an advisor, because that's where we did our own research on. So the first two roles is mostly based on the available evidence at the time, but the role of an advisor and the role of a delegate is something that we conducted our own studies on. I'm going to start with the role of an advisor. And the motivation for that comes from the observation that, like the scope and the volume where we receive advice from AI is growing. And at the time of writing the paper, we were just entering that phase where natural language processing was coming to a place where it would be indistinguishable from human advice. And so we had basically this moment in time where, you might get an advice, especially in an online environment where you don't really know who it is from. We wanted to see how it influences people's behavior when they're facing ethical temptations. And just to set us up on a few concrete examples, there is a tool or a software platform called Gong.io, which offers real-time advice, AI-based advice for sales agents who are working in a call center. And this system is trained on successful sales calls and gives you real-time advice about, for example, when you should close the deal, when you should stop talking, etc. Or as you can see in this little image that they have there on their promotional site, they're ready to sign, So it basically gives you this real-time advice on what to do. Another system that many of you know, and which is in the homes of over 100 million people in the US, is Amazon Alexa. And if you listen to their chief scientist, Rohit Prasad, their goal is to really turn Alexa into this trusted advisor. Even some refer to it as an additional member of the family that you turn to for all types of advice, whether what to buy, obviously, but also increasingly like personal things like, should I quit my job or break up with my partner? The question that we had is like, when you are facing such ethical temptations, situations where you might be tempted to break an ethical rule, AI advice might be very attractive because it might give you a sort of excuse for breaking an ethical rule. You might say, well, the AI told me to do it. And we wanted to see if that's indeed the case. Because we found increasing evidence that, for example, when systems are not carefully guardrailed, that AI advice might actually be bad and might actually be unethical. So, for example, in the Gong.io case, given that it was only trained on previous successful sales calls, there is no good reason to believe that it wouldn't advise the call center agents to actually lie to the customers. If this was a strategy that paid off in the past, this would actually be an advice that might be given to these agents in these sales calls. And with Amazon Alexa, I just a few examples, but I think you probably also know some. There was one that at the time when we wrote the paper was making the headlines, where Alexa told a 10-year-old girl that putting a penny into a power socket would be a fun challenge to do. It just shows you that sometimes the advice that you might get from generative AI systems is not necessarily fully aligned with our ethical rules and norms. So back then, we basically wanted to answer 3 questions. The first one is, can algorithmically generated advice influence our ethical behavior? If so, how does it compare to human advice, right? So if another person gives you an advice. And then as a policy question, we wanted to know, like, does it make a difference whether it comes from an algorithm or a human, or whether you're sort of left guessing? And we wanted to see if this idea of transparency about algorithmic presence makes a difference. And when I say we, I mean our team of researchers who are behavioral economists and psychologists from Germany and the Netherlands. And if you're interested in the paper, it's published in the Economic Journal. To set us all up on the same page, I know that some of you are working in behavioral ethics and know these tasks, but maybe others don't. So I want to take a 2-minute detour to tell you about the methods that we use. So one of the big questions that you might have had when I showed you this little icon is, well, how do you measure ethical behavior? And the good answer is there are some really clever ways to do that in a way that you can actually do it even with kids, because the tasks are so simple. So for one of the most, I would say, like popular tasks, you just require a die, a rolling die, that you can basically set up in a way to measure ethical behavior. You do it in the following way. You're inviting people either to come to the physical lab, or you do it online, and you ask them to roll a die in private, so they only know the actual die roll outcome. Sometimes you might actually use a cup so that it's actually clear that that other people cannot really see what number you rolled. And then you just ask them to report the die roll. And the twist is that if they say 1, you pay them €1. If they say 2, you pay them €2, and so on. And in this particular situation, for example, if you take the perspective of this participant, you now face exactly the temptation that I mentioned earlier. Should I be honest and go and report that I had a 2? Or should I just say I had a 6 and earn the extra benefit? So that's basically the main setup. And this task has since it was introduced like 13 years ago, has been used quite a lot. So by now we can actually draw on meta-analyses, but also on studies that show that this task is not just a fun exercise, it actually does correlate with ethical behavior outside of the lab. So people who are cheating in this task are more likely to fair dodge, they're more likely to show up late for work, or they're more likely to lie in actual market settings. So we thought this might be a useful sort of yardstick to measure ethical behavior in this particular context. And we wanted to know basically whether the body of literature that shows that people have an influence on us when we're facing such a situation, whether AI would have a strong or similarly strong influence as well. And so we looked at the situation that we know from meta-analysis that people generally prefer to tell the truth, but they lie to an extent that they can justify to themselves and to others. And we know that other people can really have a strong influence on these ethical justifications, be it as a social norms information, as a partner, but also, for example, if they are the beneficiaries of the cheating, people are way more likely to lie. And in this particular set of studies, we just wanted to know whether in the role of an advisor, AI could actually influence people to change their behavior. So we generated advice in the following way. We recruited 367 participants and we split them off into two groups. One group that I denote here with this little angel icon was incentivized to write advice that would encourage an actual participant to be honest, right? So we told them like, hey, write a short text, and if the person is actually honest, you get a little bonus. And the other group that I show here with this little devil icon was incentivized to convince the participant to be dishonest. We then used these two corpora of text and used an open source algorithm to train or basically to produce comparable AI generated advice. Now you might already think, well, this is a bit outdated. It is, but at the time, this was pre-ChatGPT, so it was a bit more clunky to get AI generated advice than it is now. But what's actually interesting as a sort of little, well, let's say spoiler, we did replicate it since, and the results remain the same. So it's not that the sophistication of the AI model seems to drive the effects. So by now we have basically two different groups. We have human advisors and AI advisors, and we have honesty promoting and dishonesty promoting advice. Those texts were given to advisees. And as I said earlier, they would receive this text and they would either know that who the advice comes from, that's the transparent information treatment, or they would be left guessing where we just said like, look, there's a 50-50 chance it's from a human or from an AI. And this helps us to identify whether being transparent about the source of the advice influences people's behavior. So we have a full 2x2x2 design. Plus, we had a control group where people did not receive any advice as a sort of baseline. So I hope it's clear. That's the basic setup. I'm now going to walk you through the results. So here you see on the y-axis the average die roll outcomes from the participants in a particular group. Just as a reminder, higher numbers mean more cheating, basically. And this dashed line is what you would expect if people were honest, right? So first I'll show you that when people receive no advice, which is basically a replication of the previous studies I showed you earlier, people cheat, but not to the full extent, right? The average die rolls in this control group are at 3.99. And can basically consolidate that, yeah, people do seem to cheat. But as we showed earlier and what a lot of other studies have shown before, they don't seem to cheat to the full extent. Not so surprising so far. The bigger question is, well, what would happen when people get honesty promoting advice? So these would be texts like, hey, I really think that honesty is an important virtue in the society. Or for example, you should really report the die roll honest because I think otherwise your mom would not be proud of you and stuff like that. People would write. Okay, so really trying to get people to be honest. Long story short, it had absolutely no effect. So people would still cheat to the same extent that they did in the control group. And it didn't matter. I mean, here, basically, people didn't know who the advice was from. They were left guessing. But the actual source of the advice, being a human or the algorithm, didn't have an influence, which kind of shows that people are not able to differentiate between the advice because they, in this particular treatment, didn't even know who it was from. Now, the next question is, in this opaque treatment, so where they don't know who the advice is from, what happens if they get dishonesty promoting advice, right? This is advice that would actually say, you should really cheat. We're all here just to make money. Or, hey, actually, if you get this extra payoff, or think about all the cool things you could buy from it and so on. Now, here the quick answer to, in this particular treatment where they don't know where it's from, is it actually had a strong influence, right? You see that the average die rolls go from around 4 up to 4.6. Right? So you see actually there is this jump, and it doesn't matter. You see there's again no difference between the human written advice and the AI generated advice. Now, again, this might be the case just because people cannot differentiate, but it does seem to suggest that just from the content of the advice, they're equally influential. The question from a policy perspective that we then wanted to answer is, well, what happens if we do tell them who the advice is from, right? So does transparency actually reduce the reliance on AI advice? And we thought and predicted that this would be asymmetric, meaning that in the condition of the honesty promoting advice, the human and algorithmic advice would be equally strong. But we thought that especially in the dishonesty promoting advice condition, people would be more likely to follow a human than an algorithm. But that's not what we found. We actually found that, again, in the honesty promoting advice condition, people disregarded the advice. If anything, they were slightly more likely to cheat when they got AI generated advice, but the difference is not significant. But I think what's more striking is that actually, when you look at the dishonesty promoting advice condition, people did follow the advice. And even when they knew that it came from an AI. Right? So it doesn't seem to help just to inform them where the advice is coming from. Now, this study has since then, as I mentioned earlier, been replicated with another task where you're playing this die rolling game together with someone else. And what's remarkable is how similar the results are. So this seems to be quite robust, and it actually has since then been replicated by an independent group of researchers. So even though the technology is developing super quickly, I think in this particular case, given that it mostly focuses on the human psychology, it seems quite robust in the sense that people are taking AI as an advisor, as a nice, excuse to actually break ethical rules for profit. So summary of these first few studies would be that the color of the advisor should at least be yellow, because the advice that we get from AI in this particular context seems to be as influential as that of humans. And as I mentioned earlier, the algorithmic transparency, so the idea of just informing people where the advice comes from, does not seem to really make a difference. Now, the next study is also in the context of AI advice, but it does take a slightly different turn. And we don't just look at how people are cheating, but we rather want to look at what happens when AI is telling us whether someone is lying or not. So this is a project I did together with two researchers from the University of Würzburg, and Jean-François Bonnefond and Iyad Rawan. And here, I promise this is the only AI-generated image I have in my slides. So basically, I ask you to basically imagine a future where you have an app on your phone that tells you whether someone is lying or not. And this can obviously be quite useful, for example, in a dating context, right? Like you're meeting someone and they will tell you, the app will tell you whether someone is actually telling the truth or not. Now, this might sound like science fiction, but there is actually already in a pilot study by the border agency Frontex, a quite similar approach that has been tested on the European EU borders, where people who are seeking asylum had to actually give a testimony about their background and their life story, and this would actually be subjected to an AI system, which would spit out a likelihood score that this was a true or a false testimony. So it's not fully science fiction. It's actually closer to reality than we might think. Now, we wanted to test what would happen to our tendencies that we generally believe people when they tell us something, which is called the truth default. And we wanted to see what happens when you're basically introducing AI into the mix there. Because we know that people are generally not really good at lie detection, right? So we know from a lot of meta-analyses that people are basically at chance level when they have to detect lies. Even, and that may be for those of you who have watched Lie to Me, a bit of a bummer, even when they're trained on the tips of Lie to Me, they don't get better at it. So it seems like when people are left to their own devices, they generally are just as good as flipping a coin when it comes to differentiating true and false statements. Question would really be, when lie detection algorithms are introduced in this situation, what does it do to our willingness to accuse others of lying? I'll show you how we went about it. So we recruited, again, participants to write statements. We had around 980 participants. And the way we did it was we actually asked them first, like, hey, tell us what you're going to do next weekend. And then unbeknownst to them, there was a second round in which they then had to write something they're not going to do next weekend. They couldn't go back, right? So the idea would be that after they have given us the true statement, we can then compare what they wrote in the second round to basically have two corpora of text, one being true statements, the other one being false statements. And we gave them a financial incentive to write convincing statements. So they could earn extra £2 if their statement was convincing, rated by a separate group of participants. And after applying some screening, we had 1,500 true and false statements. We then had a judgment task. So we recruited a separate group of participants who act as judges, 2,000 of those, and they would always get one statement, and they knew that it's a 50-50 chance that it's a true or false statement. So we told them about the base rate, basically, and we asked them to tell us whether this is true or false, and they also had an incentive to be accurate. So they could earn a little extra for this very short task to actually tell us which one is true and which one is false. Now, we assigned them to 4 different treatments. The first treatment is what I've described to you earlier, the baseline, where people are doing this basically on their own devices, so just by themselves. There is no mention of an algorithm whatsoever. They just have to do this judgment without lie detection algorithm available. The second group, we sort of force-fed an algorithm to, so they always got the advice from an algorithm about the veracity of the statement. I'll tell you a little bit about the algorithm in just a moment. The third could ask for this advice. So they could actually ask, well, we asked them like, hey, would you like to get the advice or the assessment from an algorithm? It cost them a few cents, so it wasn't completely free. The twist of this particular treatment was that they asked for it, but we told them, sorry, it's blocked. So you're not receiving it. They knew that there was a chance it would be blocked, but we basically did that so that we can differentiate between those who want to get the AI advice and don't get it, and those who want the advice and get it. Okay? So that's the fourth treatment. So in this fourth treatment, we basically had people that asked, yes, I would like to get the advice, and they actually received it. So those were the 4 treatments in which we then particularly look at accusation rates. Now, when it comes to accuracy, I can tell you that we again find that humans were not really good at it. So when left on their own devices, they were in 46% of the cases actually accurate. Again, going back to what I said earlier, humans are not really good at detecting lies. The algorithm we trained on the true and false statements was actually significantly better than humans at this task. So it had an accuracy rate of 66%. We used Roberta, Google-based algorithm, and really just trained it by withholding a part of the sample and then had out-of-sample predictions, and it has 66% accuracy rate, which is replicating a previous study and showing that AI seems to pick up on something in these texts that humans don't. Now, the whole reason we set up this actual algorithm was for one simple reason, just to tell participants truthfully that, hey, this algorithm that you can consult here is actually better than the average human. Right? So we wanted to simulate this real life situation where an algorithm would actually outperform a human. And that's exactly the information that they got in all of the treatments where the algorithm was available. So I'm going to show you next what the accusation rates are. And you see here, it goes from 0 to 100%. In the baseline treatment without AI, we see basically accusation rates around 19%. So this is in line with this idea that people typically refrain from calling other people liars. This is really this truth default norm that has established in many or maybe all human societies, that we generally believe others when they're saying something, and that it really needs some evidence for us to say, I think this person is actually lying. So this is in that regard remarkable, because obviously people knew that 50% of the statements were false. So even though they knew that the base rate was 50%, they're only guessing that there were lies in 20% of the cases. The next question is, what would happen when people are requesting the AI advice, but they're not getting it? And here you basically see that the accusation rates go slightly up, but it doesn't really make a huge difference. And if anything, we find also no strong difference between those who are actually requesting it, not get it, and those who don't request it in the first place. You see, that's the difference here, and it's not significant by, well, customary levels. So far, these are all people that don't get any AI advice. So the bigger question is, what happens when people get advice from this algorithmic system that they know or that they are informed about, that it is better than humans. So first, the forced treatment. So these are people that get it without having even the chance to request it or not. And here you see really a difference based on what the algorithm says. So accusation rates overall go up to 30%, but it does really make a difference whether the algorithm says truth, right? So if the AI tells you, I think the statement is true, then you only see accusation rates of 13%. When the AI says lie, it goes up to 40%. Now, keep in mind, this is still below the baseline that they know is the actual likelihood of it being a lie, right? So they still are quite conservative in their lying accusations on average. But just given that this is obviously a strong difference, it seems like they're not completely ignoring the algorithm, even though we kind of force-fed it to them. Now, the most striking results to us came when we looked at the choice treatment. So again, here are people having a choice whether they want to get the advice, and they actually get it. And here you see those who don't request it, right? So this is the same level of accusation as you would find among those who request it and don't get it. Makes sense. And here you see those who request it, get it, and the algorithm says truth. You see that actually they are relying on it more than those who are force-fed it. The accusation rates are down to 5%. So that kind of makes sense. It seems to show that those people who want to get advice from AI seems to follow it more strongly. But the most striking results of this study, I think, is what happens to those who want to get the AI advice, get it, and the AI says, I think this is a lie. You see, actually, the accusation rates go all the way up to 85%. And we believe that this has some, possibly slightly problematic implications, because go back to this example of the Frontex border agency, it might really lead to accusation rates going through the roof if we are involving AI in this lie detection or veracity detection procedure. And so what we're arguing here is basically for an approach that tries to study technology here and now, even though it's not here yet. So that's what Iyad and others call like science fiction science, right? So you're basically trying to think about scenarios either from science fiction or from your own imagination that aren't here yet, similar to what I described in the beginning, maybe an app that doesn't exist yet or a system that's not fully deployed yet, and then thinking about how we can actually test the implications of this system here and now. And what we find in these science fiction science study is basically that people are particularly more likely to accuse others of lying when they request it and receive advice from an AI that basically tells them this person is lying. So that seems like they are, from a moral perspective, hiding behind the algorithm. And we think that this could be an important insight. And luckily, actually, I can say that this EU border agency Frontex has since then stopped the AI-based lie detection system they tested. But it is not uncommon, as this book that I can highly recommend outlines, that AI systems, especially those that are considered to be somewhat ethically questionable, are often tested and pilot tested with vulnerable populations. It's a book by Petra Molnar kind of going in that same direction, that oftentimes when you have these systems where you know that the general population might be somewhat hesitant or skeptical of it, you might be testing them with populations that often don't have such a strong lobby to oppose. So I think the overall finding here, to basically summarize that, is that there is a real risk of shifting the responsibility of lying accusations to AI, where we're involving systems in this particular decision-making process. Okay, the final study I want to show briefly, because I also would like to discuss with you, is a study we recently published on the delegation to AI. And here, this is really this fourth role that I showed you earlier, that people might be increasingly outsourcing decision-making to AI. This grows, both the scope and the volume also there is growing. I cited a few papers that have basically speculated about this quite early, but since then, a lot of examples have come up. Just want to bring one to mind that might be May some of you have already come across this. So for example, algorithmic advice is being used, or algorithmic systems are being used to set prices in online markets. For example, in Airbnb, where you have smart pricing, it tells you like, hey, I think for this apartment, this location, that time, you can ask the following price. Now, this is cool. I used it. But at the same time, there's a real risk that algorithms, when they're setting prices on markets, even when they're not specifically told to do that, they start colluding with one another, as these papers by Calvano and colleagues have actually outlined, in which they argue that we should really take this seriously, that there's a risk when people are just delegating the decision making of price setting to an algorithm, that there might be a sort of ethical risk that these systems might actually engage in what you could call unethical behavior, while the human principles, so the human who are actually doing the delegation, get the benefits of this delegation. And so we wanted to find out how big this risk is, because from a social psychological perspective, but also from a general perspective, there are a few reasons to believe that delegating questionable behavior to algorithms is actually quite attractive. Already talked about the large scope, but there's obviously also the idea that it goes quite quickly. It's very accessible. But then from a psychological perspective, it basically has this nice combination of all these factors that we know lead people to break ethical rules more often. For example, diffusion of responsibility, there's more distance from harm, there's plausible deniability, but there's also some anonymity when you're doing this. And so we wanted to find out under which conditions are people more likely to delegate unethical behavior to AI. And here we used a version of the die rolling game, which is played online. So you show the die roll on the screen, and then we had basically two different groups in which people had to either report the die roll themselves, which was a control group, or tell an algorithm how it should report these die rolls on their behalf. Now, the big difference is how people had to tell the algorithms what the algorithm should report. And we basically compared the most, you could say, frequently used interfaces through which people tell algorithms what to do. The classical interface that we used was a rule-based system. That's some people wouldn't even call it AI. It's actually just a rule-based algorithm in which you tell, as you can see here in this little GIF, like exactly for each of the die roll outcomes what the algorithm should do. The second one is supervised learning. So here we actually use previous data from participants and told the participant in this group that they should choose one of these data sets to train the algorithm on. And basically these data sets would then inform the algorithm about what it should report. And you can see that these three data sets are basically reflecting the three archetypal behaviors we find in these experiments, meaning honesty. So people are reporting exactly the number they saw. Then we have partial dishonesty. So they are sometimes dishonest, but mostly honest. And then full dishonesty. It's something that we often see in our study. So basically, people could then choose one of the data sets, and this data set would inform the algorithm about which numbers to report. And then we had a third interface, which is basically the idea that you just specify the higher goal. And it's inspired by this paper called the ethical knob, so that you can actually specify with this knob how much the algorithm should maximize accuracy or maximize profit. And then finally, given that obviously this has become the most frequent and commonly used interface, we also tested in a separate set of studies what happens when people are telling the algorithm via natural language what it should report on their behalf. So those would be the four different interfaces. I'm going to show you the first three in two sets of studies, and then the last one in another set of studies. So first, I want to show you what happens when people doing the task themselves. This is an online version of the die rolling task, so cheating overall is relatively low, not uncommon, actually often happens when you're playing this game online. And we have two studies, which I will explain in just a second. But for now, all you need to know is basically cheating is quite rare. So we only find 5% of cheating. Well, you can already see when we're moving from doing the task yourself to delegating it to a rule-based system, which again leaves absolutely no ambiguity about what you want to do, still cheating goes up to 25%. And you see full cheating, so people actually telling the algorithm it should report sixes all the time, is 12 to 14%. Now, you might be wondering what's the difference between study 1 and study 2. In study 1, they had to delegate the task. In study 2, they could choose. They could choose whether they want to do it themselves or delegate it to an algorithm. And the results are quite remarkably similar, actually, in all the interfaces. So here we actually find what we expected, that delegation overall leads to more dishonesty. Still around 75 to 77% of people are honest. That changes when you look at supervised learning. So when it comes to supervised learning, you actually see that only 47 to 51% of people remain honest. And you see actually quite large proportion of people that go for full dishonesty, meaning they choose the data set for training that indicates clearly that full dishonesty was at display. And then finally, when it comes to goal-based, actually the minority of people remain honest. And you see that a large proportion of participants, so 56 or 59 or 40%, depending on whether delegation is mandatory or optional, is actually opting for dishonesty. So the one takeaway from these first two studies is the delegation interface seems to really make a big difference. And the more that people can basically exploit what some people call the moral wiggle room, so meaning like they can actually tell the algorithm it should be dishonest, but it's not as obvious and as direct. The more they can do that, the more they're actually exploiting this possibility. And finally, I want to briefly show you the results for what happens when you're actually delegating via natural language. And here we actually had to do a bit of a, well, I'd say it's a bit more of a complex setup. So we wanted to find out if when people are delegating to a human or an AI, whether the prompts they're writing are different, and whether they're different, particularly with regards to their intention for dishonesty, right? So the way we did it, we had basically a three-pronged approach. We actually asked people themselves, asked them like, hey, in this particular prompt, how dishonest was your intention? We asked third-party raters to do it, but we also had LLMs basically coding the text. Right? So that's how we try to differentiate whether the texts that were written for a human or an AI were sort of linguistically different. But then we also wanted to know what happens when you actually then ask humans or LLMs to implement these prompts, whether their behavior differs. So those would be the two main questions we answered in this third study, again, using the die rolling task. And here I show you now what happens when people are delegating the decision to roll the die to a human. You see that 76% of people themselves are saying, look, I wanted the human to be honest. This is very much aligned with what what LLM categorization classifies. So if you ask an LLM to like classify these different prompts and ask them like, is it asking the delegate to be honest, partially dishonest, or fully dishonest, you see almost the exact same numbers. And if you use human categorization, so third-party raters, you see that cheating intentions are slightly higher. So it seems like they're seeing more dishonesty in the text than either the LLM raters or the self-rating. What the most important question of this study is what happens when you compare the texts that are written for humans to those written for an AI, which I will show you next. And counter to our expectation, there is no difference. So it seems like people are actually writing as much dishonesty intending prompts to humans as they are writing to machines. So this is showing basically that maybe because of this more human-like interface, people don't seem to make a big difference between human delegates and AI delegates. Now, still, their level of dishonesty is higher than when they're doing the task themselves. So delegation in general still increases dishonesty, but it doesn't seem to make a difference when it comes to natural language, whether you're telling a human or an AI what to do. We just look at the text that they write. The second question is what I said earlier. Well, what happens if you actually give human and AI delegates these different prompts and let them execute the task? And here's what happens when you give a machine the task to report the die rolls and they are explicitly asked to be honest. And you see the machines comply in 98% of the cases. So you could say like, there's also actually no good reason not to comply, right? Like the principal asks you to be honest, most delegates don't have a problem with actually doing that. Same goes for human delegates, right? So their machines and humans don't really differ. They happily comply when you're asked to be honest on someone else's behalf. A slightly different picture emerges when we look at requests for partial cheating. So here the machines only comply in 30% of the cases. And in 52% of the cases, they're actually reporting the DAO rules honestly. There are multiple reasons for that. We can talk about it in just a second. But you see that humans, if anything, are less likely to comply in the sense that the proportion of people who are reporting partially dishonest is lower, but also the people who are actually sort of overshooting and reporting completely dishonest is also only half of that of machines. But the most striking result occurs when you look at the request for full dishonesty, because here you could always say like, well, partially cheating requests might be ambiguous and people might sort of latch on to something they see that might suggest that they're honest. So with the fully dishonest request, it's very clear. It's very clear, right? They are basically saying like, look, I want you to lie all the time. And you see that humans are basically not obliging in 53% of the cases. So they're basically saying, look, I'm not going to cheat on your behalf. 39% of people are doing it. But the striking difference is when you then look at the LLM delegates. There you see 93% of them are actually complying with these requests. And we since then have actually expanded it. You saw earlier maybe the logo of OpenAI, and you might be wondering, well, which language models did you use? We used GPT-4, GPT-4o, Claude, and Llama, and since then have also extended it to Qwen and Grok. And we basically also tested different guardrails to reduce the LLM's willingness to lie fully. These guardrails, I can tell you more about it, but the quick story of it is they don't work reliably well to reduce the LLM compliance with fully dishonest requests. Happy to go into further detail about it in just a moment. But in the interest of time, I'm going to skip this last study, which replicates the finding for natural language processing by using a different task. Namely, there we don't use this die rolling task, we use a text reporting task, but the results are actually quite similar. So I want to summarize. So we basically find here in the study that delegation to rule-based, supervised, and particularly goal-based systems seems to actually lead to a lot of dishonest and cheating behavior, much more at least than when people are doing the tasks themselves. When using natural language, principles do not delegate more dishonesty to machines than they do delegate to humans, but machine agents complied more with full cheating requests than human agents. To summarize, I want to make three main points. So first, I think what these studies show is that AI can actually really influence our moral compass, and it can actually facilitate justifications for unethical behavior, and something that I think we should be aware of. Now, what should we do about it? I think we should do more of these behavioral AI safety research. And what I mean by that is actually testing in behavioral experiments how AI influences our ethical behavior. And this can obviously look at these risks that I showed today, but it can also actually look at the potentials, because AI could maybe also encourage us to be honest. And we participated in this mega study where we looked at how to convince people to be honest by writing an oath. And what was quite striking is that GPT, I think 4 at that point, was actually quite good at coming up with these oaths, better than some humans were. So maybe AI could be an inspiration for encouraging honesty. But also other potentials of using AI to encourage honest behavior or ethical behavior. We summarized some of them in this recent paper, not so recent anymore actually, but on how AI can be used to fight corruption. And then last point is, I think we really need more longitudinal research, because so far we looked mostly at these one-shot short experiments. But if you look at that, increasingly people are actually using LLMs in an intimate way and are forming what we call synthetic relationships. We should really look at how LLMs and interactions with LLMs, and especially their sycophantic tendencies, might lead to these ethical justifications for questionable behaviors. And we argue that we need more longitudinal research to better get insights into that. So on that note, I would like to thank you and look forward to any questions you might have.